Right. And you mentioned how the Fed has kind of been having this policy for a while. But one of my questions for you is some people are blaming them, but I'm wondering about as long as the government is doing such large spending, as long as they're doing that, how can the Fed fight inflation by raising interest rates if we continue to keep on spending so much money?
Well, they can't unless they raise them a lot more than they have. I mean, interest rates are still much too low. But the problem is that the Fed enabled the government to continue to spend and run deficits year after year, decade after decade, by monetizing the debt, by helping to keep rates artificially low. That is part of the problem. You know, we didn't have a truly independent central bank that forced the government to experience the negative consequences of rising budget deficits, because had the Fed refused to play ball, interest rates would have been much, much higher, and it would have been far more costly for the government to finance the deficits, but also it would have been more expensive for homeowners, for businesses. Everybody would have felt the sting of higher interest rates, and so there would have been some political pushback to reduce the deficits, to bring down those rates. But because the Fed made it easy for the government to keep deficit spending by, postponing the pain through the artificial suppression of interest rates, it went on for a lot longer. But also, in doing that, it really disrupted the economy, because we have a massive bubble, because a lot of things were done that should not have been done. A lot of mistakes were made. A lot of businesses that never should have been created were created. Businesses that should have failed were kept afloat. And so it was a huge misallocation of resources. And so the nation is a lot poorer as a result of the mistakes the Fed made to continue enabling the U.S. government. But the Fed is still enabling the government, because the government is still running massive deficits. In fact, look at the $1.7 trillion spending bill that was just passed. That is highly inflationary. And since we already have high inflation, you're just throwing gasoline on a burning fire, because the money that is being spent, there's no tax revenue that is going to finance it. They didn't announce new taxes to pay for all the new spending. So where is the money going to come from to cover this $1.7 trillion? Well, it's going to come ultimately from the Fed. The Fed is going to create the money so that the checks that the government mails out don't bounce. But the problem is that that new money is going to be spent into circulation, and it is going to expand the money supply. It is going to reduce the value of the money everybody already has, and so prices are going to respond by rising. And what a lot of people just don't comprehend about inflation is that when you get right down to it, inflation is a tax. The sole source of inflation is the U.S. government. Now, when the U.S. government claims that inflation is rising prices, which it's not, that's not the definition, but when you kind of take a symptom of inflation and redefine inflation as being that symptom, well, now you can point to other causes, because the government doesn't raise the prices. Who's raising the prices? Well, greedy businessmen are raising the prices. They're gouging their customers. Or it's Putin. It's his fault. He's causing prices to go up. Or supply bottlenecks, the COVID-19, right? But if you define inflation properly as an expansion of the money supply, well, who's expanding the money supply? It's the government. It's the Federal Reserve. That's why we have inflation. And when the government wants to spend money, which it does, because that's how it buys votes, it spends money, all of these government programs have a cost. We don't get any government for free. Well, a lot of voters like getting stuff from government, but they don't like getting a bill to pay for it. So if they can get something for nothing, then they're in favor of it. Mm-hmm. And so inflation allows the government to provide government services to people without giving them a bill, because instead of raising taxes to pay for programs, they just create the money and spend that. But then there's inflation. And so when prices go up as a result of deficit spending, those higher prices effectively become a tax. So instead of paying higher taxes, we pay higher prices. But it ends up the same because we end up with less stuff. So either I buy fewer things because the government took some of my money, and so I don't have enough money left over to buy stuff, or I end up with fewer things because the government printed a bunch of money, and now the price of everything goes up, and because everything is more expensive, I have to cut back and I buy less. So it's just a tax, and because the deficits are so enormous, and despite what President Biden is claiming, he is running up the deficits. He's not bringing them down. He's increasing them. We have larger deficits now than at any point in our history when we weren't in the middle of a COVID lockdown, right? So if you throw out that brief period of time of insanity where everybody was getting PPP money and extended unemployment benefits, and we're all sitting at home shopping on Amazon, take out that little period, we've never seen deficits this big. And that means the inflation tax to finance those deficits is going to go up.
Right. And this inflation tax, it really falls on the poor a lot because they're the ones who have to pay for milk and eggs and all those things just like everybody else. But it really affects them, especially if you're on a fixed income. But you were mentioning how, you know, this money, it's just continuing to flow out there. What do you expect the U.S. dollar to be worth as this cycle continues and we keep on devaluing the dollar?
Well, first of all, you're right that inflation is the worst tax you could possibly impose because it falls disproportionately on the people who can least afford to pay it. It's paid by the middle class, paid by the working poor. If you're very wealthy and you only spend a small percentage of your income on, food and energy and things like that, inflation is just a nuisance. I mean, you don't really care about it, but if, food represents a big part of your budget and, you're spending everything you earn just to make ends meet, when you get the type of inflation tax that we've had, it is life-changing. A lot of people are forced to really cut back on their standard of living. Wealthy people just cut back on their investments. They have less money left over to invest, and that hurts the economy because now you have less economic growth, you have less employment opportunities, so the economy is weakened by inflation. But the wealthy, personally, aren't seeing a decline in their standard of living, but the people that they might have employed will see a decline in their standard of living, or the people who might have been employed by businesses that they might have financed, but they use some of that money to pay higher prices. But it also distorts the economy. Inflation results in a lot of bad economic decision making that undermines productivity and economic growth. But as far as the dollar, by definition, when you create inflation and you're expanding the money supply, every dollar is now less valuable because you have more of them. Because money itself, when you're talking about fiat money like we have now, we don't have real money. We're not on a gold standard anymore. It's just a piece of paper. So the money itself doesn't represent any wealth or any value. It's simply a claim to value. I could take money and I could buy something with it. Well, the more money you have, now the more money you need to buy the same stuff. If you double the money supply, everybody can't buy twice as much stuff because twice as much stuff doesn't exist. You can print money, but you can't print the goods that you buy with the money. So if you double the money supply, all else being equal, prices will double. So nobody gets anything extra just because they have more money. Everybody buys the same. It just costs more. But what's happened on the foreign exchange markets, ever since, the Fed started to pretend that it was fighting inflation by raising rates, we have seen an increase in the dollar's value in relationship to other fiat currencies like the euro, like the Japanese yen or the British pound. And so in that respect, the dollar has been less weak than these other currencies. But all of the world's currencies have been losing value due to inflation. It's not something that's unique to America, but that doesn't excuse U.S. politicians. Like when you hear a Powell talk or Biden and they say, well, inflation is everywhere, so you can't blame us. Yes, inflation is everywhere because all the politicians and all the central bankers are making the same mistake. They're all printing too much money. They've all got interest rates too low. So if every central bank pursues an inflationary monetary policy, it's not an accident that we get inflation. And it doesn't excuse what the leaders have done in one country by saying, well, we have inflation everywhere. Yes, everybody has made the same mistake. And so we should be upset at governments all over the world. So the people living in the UK should be pissed off at the British government and the Bank of England. The people in Japan should be upset about the Bank of Japan and the government of Japan for the things that they've done. But we should be equally as upset, if not more so, at Washington, at U.S. Congress and the Federal Reserve for what they've done.
Right. And it seems like the U.S. economy also affects everyone. So, like they say, when the U.S. sneezes, the world catches a cold. But it's like maybe our economy suffering probably affected people because, especially small countries, because a lot of them are less powerful than some large companies like Apple and YouTube and Google. But do you think the days of the U.S. as the world's sole superpower are ending and we won't really have that kind of influence anymore?
Well, I think so. I think certainly as an economic power and industrial power, we've been in the decline for decades now. As a military power, sure. I mean, we really don't have any rivals there. But at some point we'll lose that as well because we simply won't be able to afford to maintain the military anymore. The reason we can afford it now is because the world is subsidizing us. We've got the dollar as the primary reserve currency. And as a result, the United States is able to borrow really over $1 trillion a year from the rest of the world in order to maintain its lifestyle and to continue these expenditures. But we are exacting a heavy toll on the world. It's getting more and more expensive every year for the world to support the United States because Americans collectively, we all live beyond our means. We consume far more than we produce. Now, how is that possible? Well, the rest of the world makes it possible by consuming less than they produce and allowing us to consume the difference. So we get to live a much higher standard of living than we would normally be entitled based on our productivity because we're living off the productivity of everybody else, but everybody else is having to give up some of their standard of living in order to support the excess standard of living in the United States. And I don't think the world is going to continue doing that, especially since we keep increasing the cost. And now we're pissing off even more people with the way we're weaponizing the fact that people rely on the dollar, the way we did with the sanctions on Russia, and that's not going over very well in places like China. And they already hold a large quantity of U.S. dollar-denominated debt instruments. And so I think that the world is starting to wean itself off of the dollar. And when it succeeds in doing that, that is going to be a huge, huge problem here in the United States. I mean, that's when the chickens really come home to roost.